Once again, it is my privilege and pleasure to come and spend these few moments of your time. As I have said many times before, everything is interconnected, interdependent, and interactive. So it is important to recognize one cannot escape responsibility, even as one works, shall we say, to uplift that which is suppressing and depressing the overall changing world. The shift in consciousness cannot be stopped, cannot even be resisted before it will take a new opportunity. So that is enough to begin a conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for talking with us again today. Today I'd like to talk to you about the COVID-19 virus that's making its way through our planet. Can you please share with us as to why this is happening?
Let us start by saying there is nothing new about viruses. Viruses are a social phenomenon, whether they are on the physical level, intellectual, and even emotional. People pass on their significant features. So it is important to recognize that the challenge has always been to, shall we say, be aware of what is occurring around you. One can always sense the nature of, shall we say, disturbing news. That is, whether it is physical or health determined, or whether it is social or economic or political. All of these hold the nature of virus. And I want to put it this way. The virus nature brings to the surface that of the selfishness of humankind. So, shall we say, there are selfless ones who put themselves at risk for the benefit of the whole, and then there are the majority of selfish ones who are, shall we say, looking out for self. They are already in a battle against the neighbor. And in doing so, of course, then everything will become, shall we say, more dramatic, until it is recognized that everyone makes up the whole. And once that has come into being, then it becomes clear that one has to be taking care of the neighbor as much as taking care of self. If the whole is not, shall we say, to go down in a heap, down the plug hole, shall we say, into the sewers. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah.
So let us say then, this is not an isolated problem. This, shall we say, waking up call is not separate from what you have called climate change. I have talked about the internal climate that expresses itself in the external. And over the period of time, everyone turns their attention only to the economics. And even in this point in time, everyone has turned their attention to the economics. In sight of the madness, then of course, shall we say, all things must come to an end. Well, we say the great saying is, all things will pass. This too will pass. And along with it, the old system, whether humanity makes that choice or whether it resists until it is no longer an option. Do you follow what I mean? So it is that the world could come together as one, or it could individualize and continue to blame others. That is the nature of this. And that is not just, shall we say, an individual choice. It is the political choice. And the results, shall we say, because the outbreak as it is will not be permanent, of course, but it will not be the last. If humanity does not change its ways, if the selfishness continues, then of course what comes along is what is called the Great Flood. But it isn't a flood of water. It is a flood of different challenges to wipe away what is the separation and the lack of concern for others. Often you talk about loving, but even if one was just to have concern for others, what a great difference would be made. Then the economics, the, shall we say, the betterment of myself and the lack of compassion for the other side of the scales would disappear. And equity, balance would come into being. And shall we say, look at what has happened during this, shall we say, moment of taking stock. The planet has begun to heal already. The pollution has gone from so many airways, so many waterways. And as a result, the pollution has begun to come out of humanity. Shall we say, the cold, the flushing, the diarrhea, all these things flush out the system and bring to people's attention the dangers of overconsumption. The dangers brought about by struggle to fight such things, when one's heart is, shall we say, collapsed, heartlessness, is aligned with selfishness. And the very people who have such afflictions. Do you follow what I mean? It is not a problem of poverty. It is a problem brought about by overconsumption, by in the rich societies. The old and, shall we say, backward societies still eat the old diet. Do you follow what I mean? So their systems are in the main more healthy, more resistant than those of the overindulgent. So one also has to remember that the mind influences the body. The physical nature of reality is not as it seems. One is creating it moment by moment, shall we say, with one's ideas, and then energizing it with one's fears. And for years and years, shall we say, the society wealthy, that is the advertising and the politicians, have, shall we say, worked their magic with fears. Fears of this or that or those people, generating all of the problems of society. And now fear comes to everyone. Unless you can rise above it, unless you can hold that this is fear only brings about stresses that will lower one's immunity. So it is more taking care of oneself and offering support to others.
In terms of the problem being brought about by overconsumption, is that why the concentrated areas have spread through China and South Korea, Iran, United States, and then quickly through Europe? Are they key areas for overconsumption?
Let us say for most of them, that is the case. For most of them, they have put aside their personal well-being in order to achieve material possessions. In, shall we say, Korea, for example, just for one example, then they have forsaken the elderly for consumption. More television sets, more electronics, more technology, more, shall we say, food like the Americans. And in such places as Iran, the world has withdrawn its support. So how is it going to fight such a virus when it has no facilities? And the world looks on and points the finger, but it will spread from there. You understand, you cannot dissociate yourself from others. You cannot lie. And that has been the case. The wars are not wars of ideology, they are wars of lies. And now the world has to wake up. The shift in consciousness is an awakening to the fact that you are not isolated. You are living on a planet where everybody matters. Because if you refuse to help one, then they will breed that which will make you. You understand? It is beneficial because of this. People will have to change. And if they do not change this time round, then the next and the next and the next.
Yeah.
You understand? Or you simply ban everybody else. You build yourself apart. And you arm yourself inside your fort. And you kill others that come near your fort. What sort of life will that be? And it will not stop it anyway. Do you follow? What I am saying is the time, and we have pointed out the time was coming for a long time. I said for years there was to be a shift in consciousness. The point was, when would humanity take the choice? And it seems not that humanity would not choose itself. Then nature will choose for you.
That's right.
You understand? And if there is well-being amongst the people, then the chances are much less of a challenge. The more balanced a society, the more well-being there is, the less that people will spread.
Can you comment on the political standpoint? Obviously, there's many leaders and governments around the world that are taking different calls and different actions. Can you give us some perspective from, in a higher perspective around this?
One always has to be careful when you comment, shall we say, in this area, because those that are in political positions of power have arrived there because of the desire to be powerful, to have control. And any comment will draw attention that is unlikely to resist the undermining currents, because at the end of the day, political leaders are attempting to cement their places. So anything else is of less importance. Do you follow? So if the people are worried, then you take action, but at what expense? Do you understand? Because the people will not remember a little later on when their pocketbook is not so full. Do you follow? Fickleness in terms, shall we say, of the selfishness of many of humanity. If, as an example, a community were to recognize this, then of course everything would be shared out. And by sharing such resources, one stabilizes the whole. Do you follow? It isn't that someone will survive and others will pass over, but it will stabilize the whole, make it easier, shall we say, to recognize that it is a universal thing, that there is in the end no separation.
So this virus that we're experiencing at the moment, have we created this as a shared common enemy so that we have an opportunity to come together?
At a higher perspective, of course. But of course, but the moment you begin to say such things, then it is not acceptable. There has to be a common enemy. In this case, it is the Chinese. They are the world's enemy. But of course, it isn't that at all. It is the whole nature of the planet itself, of the awakening of human consciousness. And so it is time. And as the time, because you could argue, for example, that climate change and pollution are not really much of a problem. And then you will still kill yourselves. Do you understand? Killing yourselves is the solution that consciousness has for the problems. Everyone can agree, shall we say, there are too many people alive. Do you follow what I mean? So how do you get rid of them? And this thought instills with the rest of it. You understand, there has been all sorts of, shall we call it, public relations. That is what in politics is called presenting the best storyline. That then is boosted by the system, trying to convince of various things. Shall we call that a virus? You understand? It transmits in the same way, person to person, and shall we call them the influencers? Those are the people who have lots of connections. They meet with all sorts of people and pass on their distorted perspectives. What is the difference? Do you understand? Because each of them can lead to a breakdown in society. It breaks down and it generates a lack of trust. What is the difference? Do you follow what I'm saying? There are many stories. And how long has it been since selling an idea at the knowing the expense that it will have on others, but it is a good business. Do you follow? So all of these things result in the mechanism that creates such material things, because from a higher perspective, we have to change. Humanity needs to become awakened to the idea that there is no separation, there is no disconnection, that there is always interactivity, interdependence. So you cannot escape in a limited system. I am going to put Earth is a limited system.
Can you also help us understand, comment to the economic impact that people are going to experience and how we can ready ourselves for the long-term effects of the virus?
Economic impact is always about growing. Growing something requires resources. You understand, you cannot grow something in the desert unless you put in more resources, unless you bring in what is required to grow that. Otherwise, the whole system collapses. And that is what has happened. Economic growth has meant taking all the resources out and putting nothing back in. You understand? Then you put nothing back in and take out. Eventually, you create a desert. So, shall we say then that we have never talked in the world about economic balance of a world that trades what one has and gives back what one has without removing profit. Someone has to profit, and the profit is the growth. So, economic growth. Do you want a country, shall we say, where everything is in harmony? Then it will probably close its borders completely. Then it can be managed. Then you can produce within the country what you need. And then you do not need economic growth. Do you follow what I'm saying? So the world is arriving at an awakening that is all things in balance. That doesn't mean that you cannot have fun, but it means that if your fun requires you to overconsume, then the result, shall we say, will be a nasty headache. Do you follow what I mean? Because that is the result that comes from imbalance. If one balances, then one enjoys oneself in awareness. One is awake to the influences, and one stays within the parameters that fun is. One is not out of control. And that applies to everything. One can work. Of course, work is a benefit when you are enjoying what you are doing, producing something of value to someone else, and exchanging it for what you need. Balance. But when it is you are working for someone who is taking out and creating more for self, more and more and more for self at the expense of others, that will finally implode, shall we say, on itself. Because all of these things are the necessities of balance. Unfortunately, humankind has not reached that conclusion. And shall I say again, once you overindulge, the next day comes the headache. If you have, shall we say, more and more you take out, eventually you come to the collapse. And then comes the suffering. Whether it is health-wise, and no, that is not just with such spread of disease as it is self-inflicted problems. Does this make some sort of sense?
Yeah.
So I want to say, let us take some positive from this. The most important thing in the present situation is to bring oneself back into balance, not overindulging, not, shall we say, rushing out to the store to buy indulgent materials because they will damage your resistance. But coming into balance, hydrating the body, keeping the body hydrated with plenty of liquids. Meditation helps boost the immunity. Good exercise. Not overindulgent exercise, not running, shall we say, until one is exhausted, but taking time out to have exercise, to breathe in the air, to flush out enough, shall we say, sweat to eliminate poisons from the body. Do you follow what I mean? All of these are health promoting. And to put aside the fears, because even if everyone on the planet were to get this virus, the healthy will survive it. To understand, one has to become healthy. Healthy is mind and body and spirit, because it is a spiritual awakening.
Some say that the virus has been deliberately created and released in a way of controlling the world. Can you comment on that?
Only to say not.
Okay.
Let us simply say, even if such a thing were possible, it would not be so virulent as it is. In other words, if something was to do this, it would very quickly wipe out a complete society. And it would not spread any further. Do you understand? It has to spread because people survive it. People can carry such a thing without even having symptoms. Do you follow what I mean? Nature itself is in harmony with this. In other words, the very nature, the very shift in, shall we call it, climate all over the planet is helpful for such a virus to spread. You understand, for those places that are less altered, and there are not many of them, but in localities, some countries are not as disturbed, then the spread is less seen. It is the industrial nations that are most experiencing this.
Yeah.
So if anything were to be taken from it, shall we say, begin to take care of the balance of society within its environment. Look after the environment for the wild animals so they are not in your face. Because this is not the first possibility. I want to say, I am not saying there will be another. I am saying the likelihood is high because humanity is very slow in learning anything. Even, I want to point out, even in your book of instruction, nobody has perceived that the warnings were given thousands of years ago. Not the warnings that something would happen, but the warnings that as humanity became more selfish, then the environment would respond. Is that enough?
That is, thank you. Thank you very much.
I want to say, because it is a difficult time for everyone, I want to say, let's love fill your hearts. Love has a very high boosting for the immunity system as a whole. If one finds compassion and love for everyone, not love for your family and friends, but love for everyone. Even those that are, shall we say, the worst offenders, hold love for them. It is a benefit to yourself. Thank you for your time, your appreciation, and the work that is being done to bring about a greater awareness. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Thanks for watching. We hope this content resonates and with your help raises planetary awareness. If you are interested in attending a live online channeling session or asking Mercredan any questions about this topic or any other topics, please subscribe to stay up to date. Visit channelingmercredan.com/subscribe or click the link in the description.